So, thanks, Jed, for having me here today. What I want to talk about first is the Ukraine conflict, because I think the Ukraine conflict is highlighting something very, very profoundly wrong that we all sense in this room. Keir Starmer just yesterday said, if Vladimir Putin breaks a ceasefire, there will be serious trouble. You could see the venom in his eyes, right? You had, I think it was John Healey who said after the ceasefire, Ukraine had agreed to the ceasefire, John Healey stared down into the camera and he said, Putin, I say to President Putin, the ball is in your court. If you're serious about peace, let's see what you do. And you can imagine the Kremlin shaking in their boots, absolutely terrified at these great statesmen of Great Britain threatening Russia, right? But look at that. Why are we all laughing? Because we actually know the truth, right? We have an army that is depleted. We have an army that wouldn't even last more than 6 months in open combat. This isn't the coalition of the willing. This is the coalition of the deluded, right? And we all sense that. And there's another thing that's been going around, conscription, that chilling word, conscription, right? And let's look at the situation. By 2035, about 25% of the British population will be first-generation migrants. Tell me which one of those would be willing to die for this country. If you have allegiances from elsewhere, which is perfectly natural and normal, are you going to die for this country? Of course you're not. What about the people, the young people who've gone through an education system, who've been taught again and again that we are colonial masters, only good for slavery and causing evil across the world? Are they going to lay down their life for this country? Right? What about the actual patriots who actually do want their country back but are smeared by their prime minister as far right? Are they going to die for this country? Britain is not ready for war. Britain has a sovereign debt crisis. 95% of our debt is up to GDP, right? We're in a sovereign debt crisis. We are deindustrializing for the sake of 1% of global carbon emissions. Why? Keir Starmer was at COP29. He was there and he said, we have to be a world leader, he said. But what other world leaders were with him? Ursula von der Leyen, Joe Biden, the French Prime Minister Macron, the Chancellor of Germany, no one was there. Do you know who was there next to Keir Starmer in COP29? The Taliban. That's it. The Taliban. So Keir Starmer, again, grandstanding before the world stage, declaring that we're going to deindustrialize to be a world leader next to the Taliban, right? That is the crisis and the comical situation that our country is in. And the thing that now is becoming more apparent than ever before is that it's not virtue that will make a country successful. It's not even values that make a country successful. It's strength. Strength is what makes a country successful. And right now, under a Labour government, under successive Tory governments, we have become weak and pathetic, and we are tugging at the skirt of America for everything, right? That is the reality of the situation that we face. Why am I saying this? Why am I painting this slightly depressing picture? Because we at Reform need to realise that, yes, we can be a party of positivity. Nigel Farage has always talked about Reform as being a party of positivity, and no one can spread that positivity and slice through the electorate in the way that Nigel Farage can. But alongside that positivity, there needs to be gravitas. There needs to be a deep understanding of the profundity of the situation at hand and the colossal challenges that we need to face. Because we are at a civilizational moment. That's why we're all here. I was just talking to Jim. I was just talking to Jim just earlier. Why is he here? First time he's come to a Reform meeting. Why is any one of us here? Because we all feel there is a civilizational moment going on here. We all feel there is a democratic emergency, that if we don't do something now, the country is finished. Right? Yeah. Right? And yeah, I was just speaking to Jed before on the phone when you were on holiday. And you were telling me, you were saying that there are people who have got the choice to go to Dubai, to Bahrain, to educate their children then, have the good life. But there are people who have forsaken that good life to come back into this country, pay the high taxes, put up with a socialist government, and stand with the reform vehicle to make the change necessary, right? That is what this party is built on. That is where our strength comes from. So these branch meetings, these leaflet drops, whatever it is, that is all part of a system in place to fulfill that democratic emergency to bring strength back to this country. So, a democratic emergency. We have been denied democracy. The three biggest issues: net zero, lockdown, mass immigration. Under a Conservative government, none of us voted for that. No one in the country voted for these things. We have a Labour government that thinks democracy is about sacrificing Britain to international law. We have Lord Hermer and Keir Starmer who think that international law is like divine revelation. Right? Reform is different. Reform operates on democracy. We believe in the power of the people. Vox populi, vox Dei. The voice of the people is the voice of God. That has to be the mandate of reform as a party. That is where our strength comes from. Now, we've taken a journey, and I've listened to some of the questions before. We have taken a journey. During the general election, I would say Reform was genuinely just a protest party. It was an avenue to just unleash your emotion. As time has gone on, since the general election, we have professionalised. There is a professionalisation phase, and that is climaxing on May the 1st, where the polling has to be translated into actual ballot votes. Right? We're all celebrating the polling, but it's got to translate into actual election votes, and that's the task of all of us here. That's the professionalisation phase. But the thing we have to realise is, and I've seen the grumblings and some of the questions coming in, is that we are in some way a victim of our own success, right? We are really going for hell for leather on the polls, leading some of the polls. An insurgent party in 8 months achieving what we've achieved is unbelievable. It's quite unbelievable. It's phenomenal. But with that success comes greater scrutiny. The people who are voting for reform, some of them will be, reform has to be the next government, Nigel Farage has to be the next Prime Minister. Other people will vote reform because we're just not the Tories or Labour. There'll be other people who are a little bit, let's say, quite intelligent, who realise, even if I'm a Tory, to keep the Tories in line, I have to vote reform. Because otherwise they go Liberal Democrat. And Labour will go socialist and authoritarian if I don't vote reform. Why did Labour televise those deportations? Because they're scared of reform. Why is Kemi Badenoch now pushing hard for net zero? Because she's scared of reform, right? We are the brand that will keep the other parties honest. And a lot of people are voting for us for that reason. But we have to now win the trust of the electorate so that they're really loyal to us. And we have to earn that by being loyal to the philosophy that underpins this party. That's how it works. We can't just ask people to vote for us just because we've got Nigel Farage. We ourselves have to be loyal to that philosophy. And that's why we have to move from a protest party to a professionalised party to a governmentalised party. A governmentalised party. What do I mean by that? A governmentalised party has a sound philosophy, a foundational constitutional philosophy, and from there is policy, there is a vision of the country that unifies all of us and makes the party strong. We have a variety of speakers at council level, at even national level, who represent and can articulate that philosophy, those policies, and that vision of the country. That is what the next stage of reform is all about. Then I believe all these problems and these issues that we were asking for before will get solved. Now, Nigel, when he was asked recently, he was asked, what would you do on the first day when you become Prime Minister? And he said, I would have the legislation in place for the King's speech to make the changes necessary. So he's already thinking about this. Zia Youssef has already talked about the fact that he's in touch with policy experts. You had Nigel Farage talking with Dominic Cummings. Now, you may hate Dominic Cummings, or you may love him, but he knows how to tackle the blob. He's got the expertise. He's looked under the bonnet of government and he gets it. So we need the expertise to manoeuvre the civil service. David Starkey once said to me, I was at a dinner some months ago, and he said to me, the next government, it's not about what they do, it's about what they undo, right? It's about what they undo. So the governmentalised process is about undoing what has gone on before, the constitutional reforms of Parliament, the Human Rights Act, all of these things have to be undone so that power returns to the people and we represent the people. That is what governmentalisation means. That is what our strength comes from. That's where it comes from. Now, when I talk about philosophy, sometimes people say to me, Mayuran, this is politics. Why are you talking about philosophy? Do you know why the Conservative Party failed for 14 years? They had no foundational philosophy. They lost who they were. They didn't know who they were. They turned into Liberal Democrats over a period of time. That's what happened. You know, all these prime ministers, Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Theresa May, Rishi Sunak, they all bow down and pay homage to Margaret Thatcher. But the reality is they are children of Blair, right? They are of the lineage of Blair. And how stupid do you have to be to bow down to Margaret Thatcher but be a child of Blair? But that happens because you don't know your philosophy. You don't know your identity. And Reform has to get our identity crystal clear. We are a patriotic party, not patriotic like Keir Starmer. Keir Starmer's version of patriotism is to sacrifice Britain for the international stage. And that, the Chagos Islands deal, that embodies everything, doesn't it? Giving away sovereign land to China and paying for the privilege. And now the Chagosians are taking him to court. And he still wants to do it. That's his idea of patriotism. Our idea of patriotism is to revive what it means to be British, right? It's to revive that. Being British is not just about having a British passport. Being British is a psychological phenomena. It is a psychological, which says, I have the gratitude and belonging to these islands, to this land. I have a reverence to for my inherited history, for the institutions, for the landscapes, for the literature, for the music, for the cultural expression. I have a reverence for that. And subconsciously or consciously, I have an understanding of the immensity of how this has happened. And I'm so lucky to be part of this. Right? That is what it means to be British. Now, the thing is this. Roger Scruton, a great philosopher, he said, we don't just study the past, we inherit the past. And because we inherit the past, we don't just, alongside our ownership, we are trustees of what we have received. He said, what people have died for should not be squandered. And what he says is that what we have belongs not just to us, but to the future generations, right? To be British is to understand this. It's to understand this very, very deeply and understand the gravity of that situation. Now, if you look at me, my hardware, the colour, right? My DNA is not of these islands. My parents came here in the early 80s from Sri Lanka, right? So my hardware is Sri Lankan. That's where my ancestry is from. But my software is to do with these British, entirely British, gratitude and belonging. When I look at the war veterans who took a bullet to save this country, I say they took a bullet for me, right? They took a bullet for me, right? So that is what the British identity is all about. Reform, the governmentalisation, the strength, the identity, the revival of what it means to be British. All of that is what needs to happen to bind us all together in a unified philosophy with a unified vision. And then the policies start to come from that. Our economic policies, the idea of Brexit, the idea of how we come with net zero, our industry, all of these things have to emerge out of that British philosophy. And so what I would say to all of us is we must push and campaign for reform to be unified under this concept. Because I think once we nail this, with Nigel Farage as our leader, like I said, who can cut through the electorate like nobody else, I believe that the democratic emergency can be answered. But it requires this next step of governmentalisation. So that's what we should be pushing for in this party. Once we get that, we'll be absolutely unstoppable. Thank you very much.